come and play on the swings because we were younger players, younger legs, and we didn't want to join in with the big boys. And they used to see us, and they never used to have a goalkeeper.
I never respected him. Those were the words that echoed through football when David Rocastle faced his fiercest Manchester United rivals. When Rocky died tragically at just 33 years old in March 2001, the entire football world stopped. Arsenal fans mourned, but remarkably, even Tottenham supporters stood in silence before a North London derby, honouring a true gentleman of the game. Yet beneath that respected exterior lived a warrior whose loyalty to his teammates drove him to extreme acts of aggression, costly confrontations, and disciplinary disasters that would define one of English football's most violent rivalries. Today, we examine 3 Manchester United players who brought out the absolute worst in David Rocastle: Norman Whiteside, Paul Ince, and Bryan Robson. The story begins in January 1987. Sir Alex Ferguson later pinpointed this exact month as the true genesis of the fierce Arsenal versus Manchester United rivalry. Arsenal arrived at Old Trafford riding high on a 22-match unbeaten run. They were confident, perhaps too confident. What happened next would change everything. The atmosphere was already tense when Norman Whiteside made his move. Whiteside was known throughout English football for his intense, uncompromising style. He never held back in tackles. When the 19-year-old Rocastle received the ball, Whiteside launched into a challenge that would ignite years of hatred. Rocastle's response was immediate and furious. The young midfielder completely lost his composure. He lashed out in retaliation against Whiteside, earning himself a straight red card. The sending off sparked a major scuffle on the pitch. Players from both sides rushed in. The confrontation even spilled into the tunnel area, where Arsenal manager George Graham encountered Sir Alex Ferguson and his assistant Archie Knox right in his face. As he described it, Graham was incensed by the intimidation tactics. He made a declaration that would define Arsenal's identity for years to come. That will be the first and last time they intimidate us. We are not going to be bullied anymore. The disciplinary failure was costly. Arsenal lost the match 2-0. Their unbeaten run ended. 7 players received yellow cards that day alongside Rocastle's dismissal, but the red card represented something far more significant than a single match loss. It symbolised a turning point. Rocastle, the young star with tree-trunk thighs and undeniable physical presence, had publicly declared that Arsenal would no longer absorb physical provocation without responding. The problem was that this aggressive stance came with serious consequences. Whiteside's tackle had successfully provoked exactly the reaction that derailed Arsenal's discipline. The sending off gave Manchester United a numerical advantage and psychological edge. It exposed a vulnerability in Rocastle's temperament that opponents could exploit. Even years later, Whiteside acknowledged that Rocastle was one of the few players who came back at him, a backhanded compliment that confirmed the young midfielder's uncommon tenacity. But the cost of that tenacity was a red card, a defeat, and a shattered unbeaten run. Arsenal had gained a reputation for aggression, but at what price? George Graham's demand that his team adopt a mean, tough, the gentleman-warrior paradox was born. Off the pitch, Rocky was noted for his modesty, decency, and sportsmanlike conduct. On the pitch, he was more than capable of putting his foot in when needed, often crossing the line between competitive and reckless. The resentment from that January 1987 flashpoint simmered for 3 long years. Then came October 20th, 1990, the Battle of Old Trafford. Arsenal won 1-0 thanks to a goal from Anders Limpar. But that scoreline became a footnote to chaos. The brawl started when Limpar was challenged by Dennis Irwin. Nigel Winterburn immediately lunged at Irwin in retaliation. Irwin kicked out. Brian McClair joined in, aiming a flurry of angry kicks at Winterburn's back. What happened next shocked English football. 21 of the 22 players on the pitch became involved in the mass confrontation. Only goalkeeper David Seaman stayed away from the violence. Referee Keith Hackett later recalled that the game had been going smoothly before it suddenly exploded. The brawl lasted approximately 20 seconds, but those 20 seconds would have massive consequences. David Rocastle did not merely push and shove. Witnesses reported that he tried to throttle Brian McClair. This was not typical sporting rivalry. This was a clear act of extreme physical aggression that crossed into serious assault territory. Rocastle later tried to justify his actions. He described Winterburn as our little blood brother in trouble. He claimed Manchester United players were kicking Nigel like a nightclub brawl. His response? "You cannot have this. We went in there and we stuck up for each other." The protective loyalty was admirable in theory. In practice, it manifested as overt violence that crossed legal boundaries and threatened the sport's integrity. This was not just a sporting foul, it was an act that could have resulted in criminal charges had authorities pursued them. Yet, Rocastle saw no issue with his extreme response, believing team loyalty justified any level of physical retaliation. Both clubs were fined £50,000 for bringing the game into disrepute. But the FA went further. For the first time in English League football history, they deducted points for player misconduct. Arsenal lost 2 points. Manchester United lost 1 point. Arsenal received the heavier penalty because of their involvement in a previous brawl against Norwich City in 1989. The punishment was historic and severe. The Battle of Old Trafford became a cautionary tale about uncontrolled aggression. Rocastle's attempt to throttle McClare symbolised how far the rivalry had descended into violence. The irony? Arsenal won the league title that season despite the deduction. The willingness to absorb such costs, yet still emerge as champions, reframed the battle as a psychological victory. But the victory came at a steep price. The club's reputation suffered, and Rocastle's image as a gentleman was permanently complicated by his role in one of English football's most violent episodes. Before we continue, I want to ask you something. Paul Ince versus David Rocastle. Two midfield warriors, two different clubs, same aggressive mentality. Who do you think was the better player? Drop your answer in the comments below. Now, let's talk about Paul Ince himself. Ince was the quintessential midfield warrior for Manchester United during this era. Like Rocastle, he was a dynamic box-to-box presence, central to his club's success. The duels between these two were not isolated incidents, but sustained high-intensity competitions for midfield control. Two generals committed to imposing their will on the game. The evidence of their physical battles is clear. In one memorable encounter, Rocastle used his brawn to see off a hefty challenge from Paul Ince before scoring a brilliant goal. This confirmed that their rivalry was founded on raw physicality and a mutual refusal to concede territory. But Ince played a crucial antagonistic role in the 1990 eruption. While Rocastle rushed to defend Winterburn, Ince directed his own intense aggression elsewhere. Accounts from the brawl confirmed that Ince violently retaliated against goalscorer Anders Limpar by shoving him over an advertising hoarding. This action placed Ince at the heart of Manchester United's most aggressive actions during the melee. The midfield clash was characterised by extreme protective loyalty on both sides. Ince's attack on Limpar provided direct context for the explosive escalation. It prompted Rocastle to direct his protective fury at United's aggressors, including his attempt to throttle McClare. The relationship between Rocastle and Ince was defined by reciprocal aggression. Constant physical duels between these pivotal midfield generals dictated the overall negative tone of Arsenal versus Manchester United clashes. Their rivalry was not merely strategic but highly personal, a conflict waged over professional territory and dominance. The parallel between these two players is striking. Both were physically imposing. Both refused to back down. Both prioritised team loyalty over personal safety. But this mirror image mentality created a toxic dynamic. Each player's aggression justified and escalated the other's response. The result was confrontations that damaged both clubs' reputations and forced football authorities to implement unprecedented punishments. Now we must address Bryan Robson, Manchester United's legendary captain. The expectation of hatred between Rocastle and Robson seems obvious given the rivalry's intensity. However, the facts require careful examination. During the Battle of Old Trafford in October 1990, Bryan Robson was not on the pitch. He was sidelined, recovering from an Achilles tendon injury that he had aggravated while playing for England at the World Cup. Neil Webb captained the side instead. Therefore, any perceived animosity between Rocastle and Robson must be understood not through physical combat in that defining flashpoint, but through competitive ideology and skill-based rivalry. The true conflict between these two was waged through the ambition to surpass the opponent's greatest figurehead. Robson was the respected, long-standing captain and premier midfielder of the opposing dynasty. Rocastle's competitive drive focused on demonstrating his superiority over the standard set by Robson. This rivalry asserted itself through skill and technical brilliance rather than brutality. One goal perfectly encapsulates this dynamic. During the 1991-92 season at Old Trafford, Rocastle produced a moment of pure brilliance. He used his brawn to see off a hefty challenge from Paul Ince, then skillfully evaded Bryan Robson with a nifty step over before chipping the goalkeeper. This single goal symbolised Rocastle's mastery over United's entire central midfield structure. He neutralised both Ince's brute force and Robson's defensive intelligence in one fluid motion. This act of technical dominance against the opposition's captain represented the highest level of competitive rivalry, not just stopping the opponent, but embarrassing him with superior footballing skill. The nuance in the Rocastle-Robson rivalry is significant. While Rocastle engaged in reactive, visceral anger against aggressors like Whiteside and Ince, his confrontation with Robson was rooted in professional ambition and the quest for legitimate midfield superiority. Furthermore, Robson's absence due to injury during the 1990 brawl implicitly elevated Rocastle's role. He was the more effective, present warrior captain on that day. Rocastle's assertive leadership and aggressive intervention provided necessary protective solidarity for the Arsenal unit. Meanwhile, Manchester United, lacking their primary leader, descended into chaotic escalation. This reinforced Rocastle's status as the definitive midfield general during that crucial flashpoint. But again, we must acknowledge the cost. The rivalry with Robson, though more skill-based, still occurred within the context of extreme aggression that defined the era. The justification for all this fury returns to that moment in October 1990. Rocastle saw United players kicking Nigel Winterburn in what he described as a nightclub brawl scenario. His protective instinct kicked in. You cannot have this. We went in there and we stuck up for each other. This intense loyalty justified, in his mind, the extreme violence of trying to throttle an opponent. The paradox of David Rocastle cannot be escaped. He was universally respected off the pitch, noted for his inherent decency and modesty. Yet George Graham's Arsenal required a robust, uncompromising mentality. Rocastle became the physical embodiment of the club's transition toward a mean, tough attitude necessary to win major trophies. The aggressive loyalty fulfilled the mandate of the era. His clashes with Whiteside, Ince and Robson became essential chapters in Arsenal's narrative of overcoming psychological barriers. But at what cost? A red card in 1987 that ended an unbeaten run, an attempt to throttle an opponent in 1990 that resulted in historic points deduction, a reputation forever complicated by extreme acts of violence, even if motivated by team loyalty. Arsenal won the title in 1991 despite the deduction. The battle became a psychological victory, a successful consolidation of their identity as uncompromising champions. The confrontations that defined this era, the red card and the 21-man brawl, were crucial in hardening Arsenal's identity. They established the fierce rivalry that would define English football for 2 decades. The unique and unprecedented FA punishment of points deduction affirmed that the intensity driven by figures like Rocastle and Ince had forced a systemic re-evaluation of professional conduct. But the legacy remains complicated. Rocastle's competitive fury led him into violent clashes. His disciplinary record was marred by extreme reactions. The gentleman warrior paid a price for his loyalty. Yet even Norman Whiteside, the man who sparked it all, acknowledged Rocastle's unique tenacity in confronting him. This competitive spirit, framed by high integrity off the pitch, ensured that Rocastle's legacy transcended the disciplinary breaches. When he passed away in 2001 from non-Hodgkin's lymphoma at just 33 years old, the football community responded with profound admiration. Arsenal fans mourned their hero, but remarkably, even Tottenham supporters, Arsenal's fiercest local rivals, stood in unified silence before a North London derby. This tribute confirmed the widespread recognition of David Rocastle as a true gentleman of the game. His contributions remain synonymous with an era where Arsenal transitioned from a disciplined defensive unit to a formidable, uncompromising league champion. The rivalries with Whiteside, Ince and Robson defined not just his career, but an entire generation of English football. The aggression was costly, the discipline was lacking, but the loyalty was absolute. David Rocastle never backed down, never stopped fighting for his teammates, and never forgot what it meant to wear the Arsenal shirt with pride. That is his legacy. Complicated, controversial, but ultimately respected. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of Arsenal's most complex legends, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments which football rivalry you want me to cover next.